The year was 1347. The world was a much smaller place then. It was not connected by satellites or fiber optic cables, but by dusty roads, merchant ships, and the slow movement of caravans across continents. For centuries, the Silk Road carried wealth from the east to the markets of Europe. Silk, spices, precious stones, and strange stories from distant lands traveled along those winding routes. But in the middle of the 14th century, something else began to travel those same paths. Something silent, something invisible, an unseen passenger that required no food, no shelter, and showed no mercy. This story begins in a place called Kaffa, a busy trading port on the Crimean Peninsula. Ships from Genoa and Venice filled at harbour, carrying goods between Europe and Asia. But in 1346, the city was surrounded. The Mongol army of the Golden Horde, led by Yani Beg, had laid siege to the walls of Kaffa. At first, it seemed like any other medieval war. Then something strange began to happen. The Mongol soldiers started falling ill. A mysterious sickness spread through their camp with terrifying speed. Men developed high fevers. Their bodies weakened. Strange dark swellings appeared under their skin. Within days, many of them were dead. Desperate and enraged, the Mongols made a decision that historians would later describe as one of the earliest examples of biological warfare. Using massive catapults, they began launching the bodies of their dead soldiers over the walls of the city. Their hope was simple. They wanted the unbearable stench to force the defenders to surrender. But what they launched over those walls was far more dangerous than the smell of death. Inside the city, fear spread quickly. The Genoese traders realized they could not hold the city forever. One by one, their ships began to leave the harbor, carrying merchants and sailors back toward Europe. They believed they were escaping a siege. They believed they were escaping death. But death was already on board. Hidden among the cargo were rats, and within the fur of those rats lived tiny fleas carrying a deadly bacterium, known today as Yersinia pestis. When the ships finally arrived in the Sicilian port of Messina, the horror was impossible to ignore. The harbor officials found vessels drifting silently into port, their crews either dead or dying. Those who still breathed were covered in strange black swellings called buboes, often appearing in the groin or under the arms. The city authorities ordered the ships to leave immediately, but it was already too late. The disease had stepped onto European soil. Within days, the people of Messina began to fall ill. Church bells rang constantly for the dead. The streets filled with fear. And across Europe, a shadow had begun to spread. A shadow that would soon become known as the Black Death. By the year 1348, the plague had spread far beyond the ports of Italy. From Sicily, it moved north through the cities of Florence, Genoa, and Venice. Merchant roads and rivers carried the sickness deep into the heart of Europe. Soon, the disease reached France, and everywhere it went, the result was the same: fear, death, and confusion. Imagine waking up in the morning feeling only a slight chill, a headache, a bit of weakness. Nothing unusual. But by the end of the day, your fever rises. Your body begins to ache. Strange swellings appear under the skin. And within just a few days, life is gone. This terrifying speed made the Black Death unlike anything people had ever seen before. At that time, medical knowledge was extremely limited. Doctors did not understand bacteria, infection, or the role of fleas and rats in spreading disease. Instead, many believed the illness was caused by something called miasma. Miasma meant poisoned air. According to this theory, bad smells and rotting air carried disease into the body. So people tried to protect themselves in unusual ways. They carried flowers, herbs, and perfumes close to their noses. They burned incense in their homes and churches. Some even wore masks filled with aromatic plants, hoping the scents would filter the deadly air. But none of it worked. As the plague spread, society itself began to collapse. Families were torn apart. Parents abandoned their sick children. Husbands fled from their wives. Neighbors stopped helping each other. The instinct for survival replaced compassion. In great cities like Florence and Paris, the number of deaths became overwhelming. Graveyards quickly filled. Soon, there was no space left to bury the dead. So enormous pits were dug outside city walls. Bodies were carried there in carts and placed into the ground in layers, day after day, night after night. Because people could not understand the true cause of the disease, they searched for someone to blame. Many believed the plague was a punishment from God. Others blamed outsiders or minority groups, leading to violence and persecution across parts of Europe. Meanwhile, a strange movement began to appear. Groups of men known as flagellants traveled from town to town. They marched through the streets whipping themselves with metal-tipped lashes. They believed their suffering would show repentance and convince God to stop the plague. But the disease did not stop. Instead, death became a constant presence in daily life. Artists began painting a new and disturbing theme called the Danse Macabre, the dance of death. In these images, skeletons were shown leading kings, priests, merchants, and peasants toward the grave. The message was simple. Before the plague, society was divided by wealth and power. But in the eyes of death, everyone was the same. No crown could protect a king. No gold could buy safety. And no prayer could guarantee survival. As the plague moved north across Europe, it left something behind that people had never seen before: silence. By the late 1400s, entire regions had changed. The Black Death had reached the British Isles, Scandinavia, and deep into the countryside of Europe. And the scale of the loss was unimaginable. Historians estimate that between 30 and 60% of Europe's population disappeared within only a few years. In some villages, every single inhabitant was gone. Travelers told stories of empty towns where doors hung open and meals remained, untouched on wooden tables. There were houses. There were farms. There were animals wandering freely through the streets. But there were no people. Fields that once fed thousands were left unharvested. Wheat swayed in the wind with no farmers to cut it. Sheep wandered across hills with no shepherds to guide them. The world itself seemed to pause. Before the plague, Europe had been crowded. Too many people lived on too little land. Most of them were peasants tied to powerful lords under the feudal system. They worked long hours in the fields, and in return, they received little more than survival. But the Black Death changed everything. When millions of workers died, something unexpected happened. Labor became valuable. Suddenly, the surviving peasants had something they had never possessed before: choice. If a lord wanted crops harvested, he needed workers. And if he wanted workers, he had to offer better conditions. For the first time in centuries, wages began to rise. Peasants started moving between lands, choosing where they would work. This shift slowly weakened the feudal system that had dominated Europe for hundreds of years. But this transformation came at a terrible cost. The church, once the center of stability and certainty, also began to lose its unquestioned authority. People had watched as priests died just as quickly as the rest of the population. If the holy men could not protect themselves, how could they protect anyone else? This realization changed the way many people saw faith. Some turned away from the church. Others searched for more personal forms of belief. Mysticism, visions, and individual spirituality began to grow. Even the landscape itself began to change. Huge areas of farmland were slowly reclaimed by nature. Forests expanded across abandoned villages. Animals that had once avoided human settlements began to return. Wolves were seen walking through silent streets where markets once stood. The world felt strangely quiet. But in that silence, something new was beginning to form. The survivors were asking questions. Why had this happened? What kind of world would come next? The plague had taken millions of lives, but it had also changed the course of history. And slowly, from the ruins of the old world, a different future was beginning to emerge. By the early 1350s, the first great wave of the plague finally began to slow. The endless ringing of church bells became less frequent. The carts carrying the dead moved through the streets less often. For the first time in years, some cities began to breathe again. But the world that remained was no longer the same. Entire regions of Europe had lost nearly half of their population. Villages had vanished. Fields had turned wild. Families had disappeared from history forever. The Black Death had carved a deep scar across the continent. Yet from that devastation, change began to grow. One of the first changes appeared in medicine. For centuries, doctors had relied on ancient Greek and Roman theories. They believed illness came from poisoned air, bad smells, or an imbalance of bodily fluids. But the complete failure of these ideas forced people to start questioning old knowledge. Physicians slowly began to observe the human body more carefully. They studied symptoms. They recorded patterns. Hospitals, which had once been little more than places where the sick waited to die, began to evolve into centers of treatment and study. New ideas about disease began to appear. One of the most important was the concept of quarantine. Cities like Venice introduced strict rules for arriving ships. Vessels were forced to remain at anchor for 40 days before anyone could enter the city. The word quarantine itself comes from the Italian phrase 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. It was one of the earliest organized public health measures in history. But the changes were not limited to medicine. The Black Death had shattered the old social order. Before the plague, Europe had been controlled by a rigid feudal system. Wealth and power were concentrated in the hands of a few powerful nobles. But with millions of workers gone, the balance of power shifted. Peasants and laborists became valuable. Wages rose. Opportunities expanded. A new social class began to emerge, a growing group of merchants, craftsmen, and educated citizens. This transformation helped create the foundation for something extraordinary: the Renaissance. Art, science, philosophy, and exploration began to flourish across Europe. Painters studied the human body. Architects designed magnificent cathedrals and cities. Inventors experimented with new machines and ideas. Just a century later, the printing press would spread knowledge across the continent, faster than ever before. In a strange and tragic way, the Black Death had helped reshape the future. It reminded humanity of something fundamental: that civilizations are fragile, that nature can change the course of history in an instant. But it also revealed something equally powerful: human resilience. From the darkest chapter of medieval history emerged a new world, one that valued knowledge, progress, and the fragile miracle of life itself.